If you take a look back at the golden years of Nintendo during the NES and SNES days, one name that held a consistent level of quality and respect was Metroid. Originally released on the Famicom in 1986, Metroid was a groundbreaking action platformer the likes of which the industry had never seen up until that point. Open-ended environments, permanent upgrades to an ever-expanding arsenal, and one of, if not the earliest examples of the search action genre, as it was coined by its designer, Yoshio Sakamoto, at the time. Nowadays, this genre of open-ended action-adventure platformer is widely known as Metroidvania. By the year 1993, 3 games in this series were out, the latter of which being Super Metroid, widely considered one of the best games on the Super Nintendo. A console considering the overall unmatched iconography of its library is quite the accolade. While Super Metroid is a crowning achievement and masterclass in design philosophy, especially for the era of its release, the developers were already taking into consideration where the industry was heading in terms of design. Nintendo's Project Reality would be revealed the same year as Super Metroid's release, a partnership between Western developer Silicon Graphics and Nintendo that would become their next console with an emphasis on 3D polygonal-based design, eventually becoming the Nintendo 64, meaning games were adding a new axis. It wasn't just Nintendo, but the up-and-coming competitor in the market, Sony, was also emphasizing this type of evolution in their breakout piece of hardware, the PlayStation. Thus, the team was stumped, really uncertain how to bring this atmosphere, structure, and design that defined Metroid games up until that point into the 3D age. Sakamoto especially felt this way, who felt a 3D Metroid might be too ambitious for its own good, even with the astonishing hardware power of the upcoming Nintendo 64. Sakamoto talked about this in an interview on his idea of a hypothetical Metroid game on the Nintendo 64 at the time.
I was actually thinking about the possibility of making a Metroid game on Nintendo 64, but I felt I shouldn't be the one making the game. When I held the N64 controller in my hands, I just couldn't imagine how it could be used to move Samus around. So for me, it was just too early to personally make a 3D Metroid. Nintendo at that time approached another company and asked them if they wanted to make a Nintendo 64 version of Metroid, and their response was that no, they could not. They turned it down, saying that unfortunately they didn't have the confidence to create an N64 Metroid game that could compare favorably with Super Metroid. That's something I take as a compliment to what we achieved with Super Metroid.
To this day, it is unknown who this developer was that Nintendo reached out to create this so-called Metroid 64. There is heavy speculation that it was British studio Rare, who were the most prominent second-party developer for Nintendo at the time, creating games like Donkey Kong Country, Killer Instinct, Banjo-Kazooie, and all that. However, this has never been confirmed by any former Rare staff member when asked the question of Metroid 64. Thus, a generation of waiting began for any news on something Metroid-related. The Nintendo 64 came and went, and now it was time for Nintendo's Project Dolphin to become its successor. This was, of course, the beloved Nintendo GameCube. Late in the Nintendo 64's life cycle, Nintendo partnered with former studio head of Iguana Entertainment, Jeff Spangenberg, to form Retro Studios. Iguana was responsible for the Nintendo 64 heavy hitter Turok, and Retro Studios would comprise former members of that team and other prominent developers from other studios. The goal of the studio would be to create games for an older demographic focusing on realism. During the GameCube's development while the console was still known as Project Dolphin, developers at Retro were working on an in-house engine known as Metaforce that would help emphasize the realistic edge they were aiming for. Upon a visit from legendary designer Shigeru Miyamoto, the Mario and Zelda man, and the head of Nintendo's creative endeavors, he thought it would be interesting to create a Metroid game within this engine. Thus, the newly formed Retro Studios was tasked with creating the first home console Metroid game in almost a decade. This was the birth of Metroid Prime, one of the greatest video games ever made. To say development of Metroid Prime was rocky would be an understatement. Everything that could have gone wrong kinda did. Retro unfortunately have their production staff and cancelled all of their other projects at the time to focus all work into Metroid Prime. There were intense crunch periods, Miyamoto upheaved development halfway through to focus on a shift in perspective from third-person shooter to first-person shooter, and to top it all off, the showings at E3 were receiving overwhelmingly negative feedback. I'm not kidding, go back and look at some of these reactions. So many people thought this game was going to bite the dust. Most infamously, however, the studio head Jeff Spangenberg was a bit of a frat boy party animal. A lot of his shenanigans included spending Nintendo money on expensive cars, parties, etc., etc. It all came to a head when it was revealed that Spangenberg was hosting softcore porn sites on Retro's computers on Nintendo's company time, which led him to be immediately fired and replaced. Which then led good old Jeff to create Top Heavy Studio, whose first and last title was a little ditty called The Guy Game, a game so gross and misogynistic that even Spike TV from the mid-2000s would pull out its shirt collar when popping it into their console. Worst of all, Due to the nature of the Guy game being a mock trivia show where all the female contestants would have to flash their bare tits at the camera, there was a lawsuit filed against it by one of the contestants featured in the game who was only 17 years old when she decided to throw herself in front of the camera, leading to the mass recall of copies of the Guy game and Spangenberg being never heard from publicly again. Metroid Prime started all this. This is way off topic, just a little interesting factoid. Let's head back into Metroid Prime. Creating a game in which the core themes of the 2D exploration-based design that defined Metroid were translated into 3D would be the core philosophy of Metroid Prime's development. Take the game that was already there and work it into this new axis. The 3D environment was one thing, the first-person perspective was another more difficult hurdle to overcome. Metroid Prime's development director Mark Pacini explained how he wanted to work in a first-person point of view into the game.
We didn't want to make just another first-person shooter. Making a first-person shooter would have been a cheap and easy way to go. But making sure the themes and concepts of Metroid were kept was something that we wanted to do, and translating those things into 3D was a real challenge. For example, translating the morph ball was one of the hardest things to do.
Though the team faced incredible hardship and a mountain of stress, with the guidance of the Japanese producers and their own engineering prowess, Retro Studios released Metroid Prime in November of 2002 to almost universal acclaim. For the longest time, it was considered the GameCube's killer app that didn't just do well critically, but financially as well. It cannot be overstated how much of a landmark achievement in engineering and design Metroid Prime was at the time of its release. Consistently delivering a gripping gameplay loop reminiscent of the Metroid games that came before it, but with the coat of paint that only dreams were made of at the time. Metroid Prime was on top of the Nintendo world for that brief period. Personally, I experienced Metroid Prime as one of my first GameCube games. It came in a bundle with the console that me and my brother got as a Christmas present in 2004. Mind you, little 6-year-old Fupasan was jumping around in Mario 64, watching Nickelodeon and eating puzzle pieces. I hadn't seen anything of this sort when I was that age. So when I loaded up the game for the first time in a condo my parents rented for a holiday vacation, only to not see happy-go-lucky stuff and instead see the intro where I saw the main character Samus Aran for the first time, goosebumps. Chills, even. I was enthralled. I was shooting, exploring, adventuring, shooting down aliens, and collecting cool new weapons and abilities. Seeing all the cool, more grown-up things I could never do in other games I was used to. I remember seeing aliens get mauled and just being amazed. If there's one thing I think Metroid Prime does better than most games even today, is its sense of scale. Environments and architecture that you platform and blast your way through are given the emotional weight and presence they deserve through a masterful sci-fi techno soundtrack by series veteran composer Kenji Yamamoto. Like walking into the Hall of Elders and seeing massive statues depicting holy Chozo warriors and priests, hearing that absolutely piercing sound of the synthetic choir echo through, is something that cannot be matched. All of this context without a single line of spoken dialogue from anyone. There's something that's still so interesting about Metroid Prime. It doesn't really explain itself, and it doesn't really have to. The game wastes no time in delivering what it wants to convey immediately out the gate. allowing for a natural desire for the player to connect with this world in a much more hands-on way, scanning lore documents, creatures, and enemies. It weaves a narrative through this and lets the player gauge the weight of its context for themselves. This, in turn, allows the main gameplay loop of exploring, collecting, and fighting to be enhanced through the player's understanding of the world around them, a concept that works in the Metroidvania style beautifully. The game itself, I feel, has aged tremendously well, especially with the surge in popularity the genre of Metroidvania received in the 2010s. Anyone with an understanding of these types of games should have no trouble feeling right at home with what this game offers. I will say the definitive way to experience Metroid Prime for yourself is with the brand new remastered version available on Nintendo Switch. It offers modern control schemes and an absolutely breathtaking coat of paint. I gotta say, I feel like a 6-year-old again, noticing all the subtle details I didn't notice before due to the high resolution and extra detail. Metroid Prime does have its hiccups with certain enemy designs and the ending sequence that is there for no reason other than to pad out the game time, but I feel that these problems melt away with repeat playthroughs, something fans of the genre probably already do with their favorite games. For me, a Metroidvania only gets better the more times you play it, and at this point I've replayed Metroid Prime so many times that I've lost count. Once everything clicks and you memorize everything about the world and the little nuances here and there of the design, you just begin to breeze through the game, blasting away while feeling yourself getting stronger and stronger. This is the main appeal of Metroid Prime and the genre it represents as a whole. With the game now being over 20 years old at this point and the remaster on Nintendo Switch existing, it's insanely impressive how well the fundamental foundation of Metroid Prime still holds up today. With how popular the Metroidvania genre has become, especially in the indie scene, I have no doubt that a whole new generation of people will find a new appreciation for this absolute masterpiece. The future of Metroid is bright, and for Metroid Prime in particular, it's similar. After Metroid Prime was released in 2002, it was succeeded by 2 more games and a brilliant compilation for the Wii. After what seemed like a permanent hiatus, the 4th mainline Metroid Prime game was announced in 2017, and has yet to surface again. Though it is still being worked on through constant reassurance by Retro Studios and Nintendo themselves. Metroid Prime, even after 20 years, continues to be a shining example of the best qualities of the Metroidvania genre, and that is a true testament to the power of the small dev team working desperately to bring it to fruition, and I cannot wait to see what this series has in store for me when Metroid Prime 4 rolls around. I'm John Fupasayan, and I'll see you next mission.